Hey guys, this is your Hyphist here with another sort of video, our second video of sorts in this troublesome trilogy. As always, thank you to Steven Erickson for commenting on the last video and for sharing it as well. I urge all of you to go read the comment that Erickson left behind in the last video because I thought it was very powerful. Because often we underestimate the impact that writing has on the writer, and often when writers like Erickson immerse themselves so sincerely in the world that they create, we can often sort of forget about the effect that it has on them when they try to get into the minds of these sick people, right? So Erickson in his comment talks about how writing many of these scenes left him with a sense of helplessness and self-loathing, all of which I think are extremely important points, right? Because these things can just be so understated sometimes, but they're also such an important part of us dissecting the overall issue. On another note, tomorrow is the 1 month anniversary of this channel. So thank you guys to how much it's grown. I had no idea that within a month we would almost be at 500 subscribers, and that we would have this ongoing conversation with Erickson. It's all been kind of mind blowing. As always, thank you to Ishka Jarak for, as I said in my first video, for kind of pushing me in his own way, and for being a gateway through which so many of us have now sort of joined the YouTube scene. If there was no Ishka Jarak channel, there would be no Ruth and Bad channel, right? It's as simple as that. So with all that said, let's get into today's topic, which is obviously the treatment, the abuse endured by Jannat in Reaper's Gale. And I don't want this to be another video on cultural relativism or moral relativism, because when we come to the dust of dream stuff, as you guys probably know, we will have to bring that up a lot, right? One of the foundational arguments to put Dust of Dreams in context is the idea of the noble savage and the idea of cultural relativism and things like that. So I don't want this to be my cultural relativism trilogy. So I've decided to go with a more psychological approach for this particular one, right? Which I think suits our purpose as well. Because if you think about it, if you look at the three storylines that we've identified, the Bidithal one in House of Chains is a cult. It has more to do with religion and superstition. And the Dust of Dreams one has more to do with tribal practices, especially in a proto-human or whatever society, right? Whereas, so therefore, the whole cultural relativism, moral relativism idea would play well into those two debates. But for this one in the middle, where it's essentially torture being sort of meted out / perpetrated by the state, where it's almost on the one hand police brutality, and on the other hand a sort of mental chess game between Jannat and her captor. I think all of that makes it pretty different and interesting, right? So first, as we did in the last video, let us quickly touch on the prevalence of this issue in the real world. Because once again, I think when people say, what was the point of all that violence in Reaper's Gale? I don't understand what the purpose was. I don't understand why it needed to be there. Of course, our entire argument shouldn't be that because it happens in the real world, it has to happen in a story as well. But the first step in our argument, the first step in us putting forward an alternative perspective, surely has to be that this is a big problem in the real world that a lot of other authors do not seem to want to touch. Let's look at the nature of captivity and torture itself. Right now, once again, I don't want to go into the whole Western, non-Western thing. So here's the only mention I will make of the whole Western, non-Western dichotomy in this video, which is that the conversation on torture, particularly the conversation on torture under state custody, police custody, or anyone else of the security architecture, right? If it's kind of a counterterrorism or whatever it is. If you notice, the majority of the rhetoric on torture in the Western world now has shifted into things like waterboarding, right? Which is brutal, no doubt, right? But it's certainly not on the same level as certain hard measures of torture that we see in certain other parts of the world, right? Just look at what the official Human Rights Commission reports of many developing countries say, right? I mean, you could go to even sort of relatively prosperous developing nations, right? Turkey, India, Brazil, even countries like Indonesia, right? Just go look at what is happening in police custody in many of those countries, and what happens will kind of make waterboarding look like a, I mean, I don't want to use sort of a walk in the park kind of analogy, but it kind of is far less brutal, right? And the point that I'm trying to get at here is that many writers these days, perhaps because the public conversation on torture has itself become pretty sanitized, they seem to tend to avoid it. I mean, in how many books do we see a rescue scene, for example, where somebody's in a dungeon and then their friends come to rescue them and they say, oh yeah, let's get out of here. And they break their friend out and our protagonists just escape and ride on and fight their way through prison without sort of there seeming to be any real consequences. But when you think about it, if you think about a medieval world and if you think about a medieval dungeon, if you head in there to rescue a friend of yours who's a captor in a dungeon, you are likely to find your friend covered in urine and shit, right? Sort of having to fend off rats, right? All of that is what actually happens. And when you look at the treatment that Janath has to kind of go through here, there's a lot of that kind of stuff, right? Where Erikson does not really hide the true nature of captivity from us. It's not a hygienic thing. You are going to be sort of shitting yourself and pissing yourself, and the room that you're kept in will reek, and you will be bruised and battered at the hands of these people. So the Erikson surprisingly does not really become that visually graphic in this story. A lot of it is implied rather than what's actually shown, right? But that's one thing, right? The nature of captivity is very bleak, very harsh, very cruel. And one of the things that I liked about this whole story in Reaper's Gale is that Erikson stays very true to real life accounts of sexual torture, to real life accounts of such things. Once again, we'll go into some real life examples in the next video, right? But just looking at the use of torture itself, private torture chambers, for example, there was Saddam Hussein's son is a very famous example, right? Uday Hussein, of someone where there's documented evidence that he had his own torture chambers, and he would sort of bring girls and women there to torture them. The Abu Ghraib torture center, which of course became internationally famous because of what American soldiers did there. What was happening in Abu Ghraib before the Americans came was 10,000 times worse, right? In terms of fathers being forced to rape their daughters, sons being forced to rape their mothers, brothers being forced to rape their sisters, the use of sexual torture against dissidents, the use of sexual torture against political opponents is something that's pretty widespread even in the world today, right? If you look at war crimes investigations into places like Liberia and South Sudan and things like that, I'll get into some of the more prominent examples like the Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda and the Criminal Tribunal on Bosnia, former Yugoslavia, whatever you want to call it, things like that in the next video, right? Because the use of rape as a weapon fits a lot more into our themes in the next video. But for now, I just ask you to keep in mind that what happens in this book happens all over the world even today. And in my personal opinion, just one man's opinion, Erikson should be commended for not shying away from the brutality of that, for not shying away from the realism of that, right? For showing us the actual extent of the horror that these people feel. So that's the issue. Now let's look at what Erikson tries to establish through the storyline. Let's look at what we as readers can get through the storyline. And here's where the Jannat story is so interesting for me, because on the one hand, as I was saying, it's a story about a woman being sexually tortured by a man. But on a deeper level, when you reread it, it's also the story of a woman using her superior intelligence to torture a man. And what I mean by that is, in a weird way, their dynamic reminds me of Hannibal Lecter and Clarice in like Silence of the Lambs and those films, particularly in the way that it was imagined in the Thomas Harris books, right? Which is that if you look at the whole Hannibal Lecter Clarice thing, Hannibal is the one in prison, right? He's the one who's confined, whose physical agency has been taken away, and yet because of his words and because of his mind games, he's the one who seems to have an advantage over Clarice. And in many ways, you can apply that dichotomy here as well. Even though Janath is the one tied up, even though Janath is the one being brutalized, and she's the one being raped, in each of the episodes that they have together, it ends with her winning. And it ends with him losing because he knows that she is getting into his head. They have, if I'm not mistaken, about 4 scenes together, right? 4 episodes together. And this whole theme of someone having power over you on the surface, but you being the one who has the actual power, is something that we see recurring throughout Reaper's Gale, right? So, for example, Taralak Veed thinks he has Icarium under control by having him as his friend, but Icarium just walks off into his own warren in the end. The Edur think they have control over the Letheri Empire, but it turns out that they've just been sucked into the machinations of the Letheri Empire. Rula thinks the sword belongs to him. He doesn't realize that he belongs to the sword, right? It's the sword that has power over him. What else? There are these analogies everywhere. The triple god thinks that Kasa is walking into his trap, that Kasa is being lured into becoming his champion, but it turns out that Kasa has no interest in that, and Kasa just throws the triple god's offer away. The patriotists think they have control over the kingdom, but it turns out that the people are revolting, right? Towards the end, as I mentioned in my George Orwell video, Karos Invictad has physical power over Tehol, but Tehol is the one who wins the battle of wits, right? So this theme of physical power belonging to one sort of side, but the other side essentially just thwarting it, the other side essentially just rejecting, right, and disproving this notion of power. That's a theme that runs very strongly through the sort of the entirety of the book, right, of Reaper's Gale. So let's look at some of their individual encounters. So the first time we see them talking to each other, he is and by the way, the first time you read Reaper's Gale, all of this will be hard, right? But the rereads make this a lot easier, because in the rereads we already know what's going to happen, and because in the rereads we are able to read into and understand Jannat's manipulative skills a lot better, it makes it a lot easier to digest. Because when you read it the first time, you're pretty scared for her, right? But when you read it the second time, you kind of start realizing that she is the one playing mind games with him, and she is the one who uses his kind of perverted psychotic masculinity to sort of defeat him. So the first time we see them talking to each other, she tells him, right, and this sets the tone for the rest as well. She says this, she says, oh, listen, you might be able to tie me up, you might be able to rape me, you might be able to brutalize me, but every time you do it, I get into your head just a little bit more. I start seeing who you truly are just a little bit more. And I start I start stripping you, right? I start stripping your mind, right? The way that you've stripped me of clothing. And I see all your weaknesses. I see all your insecurities. I see all your fear. And this is such an interesting scene because it starts off with her being his prisoner and her clearly being tortured and covered in shit and starving and things like that. But that scene, if you go back and read it, ends with Janath laughing and Tanal Yatvana just bolting out of that private torture chamber that she has, right? It's almost like a horror movie. And I think the word that Erikson even uses is her laughter cut like broken glass or something like that, right? So he's torturing her, and then she starts telling him this: "Oh, I'm going to start getting into your head. Each time you rape me, each time you torture me, I get into your head just a little bit more. And I start seeing you for who you are. And you start becoming vulnerable to my words." And he freaks out, and with her laughing like a maniac, he bolts out of the door. He runs out of there. And this is a theme that we will constantly see recurring over and over again whenever we see Janat's sexual torture, where Tanil Yatvana does his best to use his masculinity to conquer her. And what I mean by that is, he wants her to love him, and he thinks that showing her his manhood, showing her his masculinity, showing her how he can love her as a man, how strong he is as a man, he thinks that all of those things will conquer her, will make her submit. But she refuses to sort of let that conquer her. The second time they meet, she gets into his mind a little further, because she starts making him skeptical of Karos Invictad, right? When the book first starts, Karos Invictad and Tanal Yatvana, even though they have a problematic relationship, Yatvana is still pretty loyal to Karos Invictad. But Jannat starts getting into his mind, and there are even scenes where she's not even there, where Tanal Yatvana is somewhere else, and he has a monologue about the Patriotists and Karos Invictad and things like that, and all of a sudden he can hear Janat's words in his mind, right? Saying, "You're wrong, right? These guys are wrong. These guys are crazy." And he even says, "Oh, that woman's in my head now. I have no idea what to do." He is tortured by it. He is suffering from this mental warfare that she perpetrates on him, despite the fact that he has all this physical control, and despite the fact that he is treating her in such a brutal fashion. The third time they meet is when she finally escapes. So Karos Invictad says, "You need to kill her, right? We need to get rid of her. Things are getting out of control here." And he realizes that he can't, right? Because her words and the way that she's kind of conquered his mind is so absolute that he is unable to kill her. And he says, "Okay, you know what? I'm going to run away. I'm going to take Jannat with me, and we're going to live happily ever after as a couple." And once he gets there, she instantly breaks him again, right? She starts saying, "Oh, I wish I would die so that I could come back as a ghost and haunt you." And it kind of just breaks his heart, right? Because even on the third encounter, where he wants to just forgive her and live with her, she essentially, she not only resists him, but she also delivers this sort of really, really scathing observation, which points out just how psychotic he is even to himself. And he kind of knows that love will never be possible between him and this captive of his, right? Because, as I was saying, he's a sexual psychopath, and it takes a special kind of mind to be able to stand up to that. It takes a special kind of mind to be able to break that. And Janath is one of the few people in the series with a mind capable of doing that. Listen, there's a reason that Tehol likes her, right? And there's a reason that Tehol fans consider her to be a worthy spouse, if you will, for Tehol. Because in terms of her intellect, in terms of her mental strength, Janath is without a doubt one of the highlights of the series. When people tell you that they hated these segments in Reaper's Gale, just ask them if they can think of another female character in epic fantasy who has displayed more mental strength than Janath, right? She is being tortured here. She's become this emaciated skeleton. She is starving. She shit herself, pissed herself, right? She's covered in shit and piss, and she's the skeleton now. And this guy's been raping her over and over, chained her and raping her over and over again. He tortures her, and yet she refuses to break, and yet she refuses to yield. Not only does she refuse to yield, but she also keeps waging this psychological warfare on him to the point where she wins. So after this third encounter, he becomes really frustrated. He knows he can't keep her there because Karos Invictad has told him to sort of get rid of her. So he takes her to another place, and Bug finds her and rescues her, right? So this is their first kind of story together, where we see this recurring thing. Remember the video where I spoke about Kasa Along and Samardev, where I said it keeps going back and forth, and in some episodes Kasa wins, and in some episodes Samardev wins. Here there's nothing like that. In every episode, Jannat wins, and in every episode, no matter how much physical power Yatvana tries to impose on her, the difference in their mental strength is so high, and Janath is so smart that she keeps kind of winning every time. She then, of course, gets rescued. Her memories are taken away. In the one scene where she almost gives up, right? There's one scene where she almost gives in to the madness, and that's when Buck kind of rescues her. Towards the end of the book, she gets captured again, right? And this becomes a lot scarier because Erickson almost makes it look like Yatvana has won. And I think this is why a lot of people in their first reads have a hard time with it, because we realize only at the very end that this had been Janath's game all along, right? Because when he captures her again, we don't really see any interaction between them. We only see it from Tanal Yatvana's perspective, where he says, "Oh, that is completely that he has Janath under control now, right? That she acts the way he wants her to act. That she's sort of become sort of filled with lust and desire for him." So when we read it as readers, we go, "What the fuck, right? How could he have done this to Janath? How could this happen to the Janath character?" But in their fourth episode together, which is their final episode, sort of their final scene together, we find out that it was all a ploy by Janath, right? And I remember reading that the first time being so kind of disturbed by it. But when I read it the second and the third and the fourth times, it was a lot easier, because we know that she is manipulating him the whole time, and that she's doing this. Even the part where she pretends to be kind of filled with lust for him, she is actually calculating the exact moment where he kind of orgasms and where he takes a breath, because she plans to strangle him. She plans to strangle him with the very chains that he has been using to keep her bound, right? So she pretends to be into him, and she pretends to kind of enjoy having sex with him, to calculate exactly when he lets out that breath. And when she's ready to act, she has completely fooled him into thinking that she's almost in love with him, to the point where he even kind of in his kind of his final moment of getting outwitted by Janath, he kind of gives the chain a little more sort of space, so to speak, and she uses that extra length to, just as he orgasms and just as he kind of exhales and lets his guard down, she immediately uses that extra length of chain to kind of strangle him to death, right? And that's once again a great metaphor. The very chains that he had used to keep his slave are the chains that were used for her freedom, were the chains that she used to strangle him. And the first time they meet, she even says this, right? She says, "Listen, I'm going to get into your head. You might think that I am the victim here, right? But you don't realize that you are just as much a victim as me. And pretty soon, the chains that you have around me, you will have chains around you in a similar sense," right? And she, of course, means this as a metaphor in the beginning of the book. But by the time we come to the end, this metaphor has almost become reality, where it's literally her own chains that she uses to strangle him, right? So once again, I know there's a pretty difficult issue, but my interpretation of the Janath sexual torture storyline has always been this: that to me, it is the most powerful depiction of psychotic masculinity, if that's even a word, trying to conquer a woman in this militaristic, authoritarian way, and the woman just refusing to yield, right? The woman just refusing to mentally surrender to his games, to his perversion. and that's why Jannat to me is one of the best characters in the entire series. I would also add that Reaper's Gale in general is one of my favorites when it comes to the use of female characters in the series, because all the books obviously have great use of female characters, but when you look at this one, right, you have Jannat, you have Samardev, you have Tavo, you have Helion, you have Sher Kilale, you have Seren Pedak, you have the sort of the dragon sisters, right? In terms of just the you, and they all have moments where they shine. They all have a big impact on the story. They all have sort of these scenes where you go, wow, this is an awesome character, right? So you can say that about a lot of female characters and a lot of other books in the Malazan series as well. But to me, if I had to pick one book which was my favorite, sort of that had my favorite use of a cast of female characters who are all different and who are all so impressive in their own way and interesting in their own way, it would be Reaper's Gale, right? And as I was saying earlier, the next time somebody kind of talks about how disgusted they are by the storyline, my answer to that would be yes, it was brutal and it was difficult to read and all that. But can you think of a braver character than Jannat in in fantasy fiction, right? Can you think of anybody who has endured what she endured and who still managed to wage this successful mental warfare, psychological warfare against her captor, right? This kind of game of wits. It's ironic that Tehol is engaged in a battle of wits with the leader, with Karos Invictad, and Janath is engaged in a battle of wits with his henchman, with Tanal Yatvana, right? The two who would eventually become the king and queen of the empire were engaged in this. And in both cases, the state, the authoritarians, had physical power over them. Karos Invictad has Tehol as a prisoner, and as I mentioned in the other video, he even beats up Tehol with his scepter, but Tehol has already won the mental game. And that mirrors this as well, where no matter how badly Yatvana treats her physically, she keeps winning because as far as the mental game goes, she triumphs. To me, she is one of the most unbreakable characters in the entire series, and even though reading this the first time through was very difficult, rereading it over and over again is actually a lot easier, right? And since we know what we're doing, I mean, she's the second time when you're reading it, where he sort of is bragging to himself about how she has embraced him and she now wants to have sex with him all the time and all that. The second time we read it, it almost becomes amusing in a very cold and cruel sense, because you're getting played, man. You're getting played by her. You think she is your slave, but you are her slave. And she is about to kill you like the idiot that you are, because you are no match for this woman's intelligence. You are no match for the way that this woman thinks, right? So to me, ultimately, that's how I see the Janath Yatvana story. A game of mental warfare between a strong, intelligent woman and a cowardly, perverted man. And even the way that she defeats him isn't by just adopting masculine characteristics. It's not like she just challenged him to a fight and kicked his ass. She kind of uses her charms to kill him. She uses her charms to overcome adversity and to sort of just break this guy, right? Because in the beginning, she keeps saying, all of you in the Patriotists, you're all just small-minded psychopaths and bullies, and Karos Invictad is a failed academic, and you are someone who's probably been abused as a kid, and now you take it out on me. And the way she just breaks it down and the way she holds true to the promises that she made was just excellent, right? So that is how I interpret the story, guys. All of you are, of course, welcome to interpret it in your own ways, but I hope this perspective added something to how you see this. So thank you, guys, and see you next time.